Hello everyone, and welcome to our second Q&A episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and I hope that everyone had a very happy holidays. The date of this episode's release is December the 30th, and we're about to close off the hellacious year that was 2020. I released our original Q&A episode 2 years ago, and it seemed to go over very well, so I thought now would be a good time to do another one. What's interesting is that a few of the questions I received this year were repeats of questions I already got back in 2018, but due to the passage of time, I might now actually have different answers to some of them, so stay tuned. Anyway, without any further ado, let's get started. So I'm going to start off by answering the question that I received more than any other, and variations of it were sent in by listeners Darren, Christy, Charles, and Patricia. One variation of this question was, if you could wave a magic wand and get all the answers to a crime/mystery/missing person, what would you pick? Or, which case, if any, would you like to know what happened and see solved the most? Well, anyone who knows me well will guess that my pet case is the Winter Garden Furniture Store murders, which took place on Christmas Eve in 1975, where Tommy Ziegler was convicted of these murders and has spent the past 4 decades on death row and is still there at the age of 75. There are a lot of people, including myself, who believe that Tommy was wrongly convicted, and the case has remained so controversial that they have never gone through with his execution. This is an incredibly convoluted case, and back when I originally recorded my podcast episodes about it, I still had the mindset that even if Tommy was guilty, there's no way this crime unfolded like the prosecution presented at his trial, as the scenario they presented just had way too many holes in it. Either way you look at it, this case is a massive jigsaw puzzle, and it's really difficult to put all the pieces together and make them fit, because we basically have a 2.5-hour window when these murders took place, where a lot of different events unfolded, but there are just so many different versions from different witnesses, so it's hard to get a handle on what actually happened. So if someone could ask me about which case where I would want to find out what happened from point A to point Z and get the full truth, it would definitely be this one. What's crazy is that earlier this year, Tommy actually wound up contracting COVID, and even though he's a very elderly man and got very ill, he wound up pulling through, and he's still holding on today. And they recently elected a new state attorney named Monique Worrell, who has promised to do new DNA testing in this case when she enters office sometime next year, so we may learn about some new developments in this case in 2021, so fingers crossed and stay tuned. Another variation of this question that I was asked was, what are your top 5 unsolved cases you would most like to see solved? And that is such a difficult question, because if you ask me this question on a completely different day, I might give 5 completely different answers. But for now, I'm just going to reel off 5 other cases besides Tommy Ziegler that I've always been obsessed with and would like to know the answers to. Obviously, one of them is the Aileen Conway case from Unsolved Mysteries, which was the topic of my first podcast episode of The Trail Went Cold, because that's another weird death where you can't really concoct a scenario which makes 100% complete sense, so I'd give anything to know what actually happened in that case. Another Unsolved Mysteries case, which I've covered on the podcast and have become particularly obsessed with this year, is the murder of Terry McClure. As you well know, her son Tim was considered to be the prime suspect, and while there are a lot of good reasons to believe he might be guilty, when he was charged with the murders in the early 1990s, the charges wound up being dismissed with prejudice, which is extremely rare in a murder case and means he can never be charged with the crime again, even if new evidence surfaces. So I've always been dying to know what reason there was that the cases were dismissed with prejudice and find out for certain if Tim actually did it or not. Another case I've been obsessed with for many, many years is the West Memphis 3 case, and I know there's been a major push this past year to release the evidence to perform some more advanced MVAC DNA testing, so hopefully that will take place because it might give an idea of who the killer actually was in this case and finally close it for good. Another one that I'll talk about more later in this episode is the JonBenet Ramsey murder. I'm not as obsessed with it as some people are, but it still drives me crazy because I think this is one of those cases where no scenario makes 100% complete sense. I always cite the bizarre ransom note in this case as one of the most baffling clues ever presented in an unsolved murder because no matter which slant you take, whether you believe the family did it or an intruder did it, the ransom note makes no sense whatsoever, which is why I would love to find out a full resolution about what actually happened in this case. And one more case which drives me crazy and I've become a bit obsessed with these past few years is the murder of Garrett Phillips, a 12-year-old boy who was killed inside his apartment in a small town in New York in 2011 and was the subject of a HBO documentary last year titled Who Killed Garrett Phillips? I know that Nick Hillary, the ex-boyfriend of Garrett's mother, went on trial for the murder a couple years ago, but he wound up being acquitted, and it was a pretty big deal because this was a bench trial, and a judge made the decision to acquit him because he felt that the evidence just was not strong enough for a conviction. And this is one where, no matter how hard I brainstorm, I cannot come up with a scenario which makes 100% complete sense. Somebody was inside that locked apartment with that boy and killed him, and somehow managed to get out without anybody seeing anything, and so it's really hard to get a handle on that, and I hope we do get answers in this case someday. Well, our next question, or variations of it, were sent in by a number of different listeners named Abby, Charles, and Joe, and that's, what's the one case you've covered that you'd love to see solved, or think there is potential to be solved soon? Well, interestingly enough, back during our first Q&A episode in 2018, I was asked this exact same question, and my answer was the case of Orange Socks, the unidentified Jane Doe who was found murdered in Texas back in 1979 and was found wearing nothing but a pair of orange socks, which is why she got her nickname. And the reason I picked that one is because a couple months before I recorded the episode, I heard that the DNA Doe Project was looking into her case and trying to identify her, and I'm happy to announce that my answer turned out to be right. In the August of 2019, it was officially announced that Orange Socks had been identified as a woman named Deborah Jackson thanks to DNA testing and genetic genealogy. I guess the case isn't 100% completely solved because we still don't really know who her killer was. I know that Henry Lee Lucas was convicted and sentenced to death for the crime back in the 1980s, but as you well know, Henry Lee Lucas was notorious for confessing to crimes that he did not commit, and there was strong evidence that he was in Florida at the time the murder occurred, so hopefully they can conclusively identify her real killer sometime in the future. But for that reason, because this case was taken on by the DNA Doe Project, my next pick for the case I would like to see solved is the Sumter County Does, the unidentified John and Jane Doe who were found murdered in South Carolina in 1976 and have still not been identified to this day. I know that the DNA Doe Project is currently working on that case, and I'm hoping that now that they have the proper DNA, they will eventually make an identification sometime in the near future, and that the Sumter County Does will finally have their real names again sometime in 2021. And another case that I covered on the podcast this past August, which might officially be solved soon, is the 2011 disappearance of Bethany Decker. As you might know, her estranged boyfriend, Ronald Rodan, was considered to be the prime suspect for many years, and he wound up going to prison for the attempted murder of another woman a couple years later. Well, his sentence for that crime was about to expire, and Ronald was about to be deported back to his native Bolivia, but a couple months ago they decided to charge him with abduction, and just a few days before this episode was recorded, they wound up charging Ronald with murder as well, even though Bethany Decker's remains have still not been found, but they apparently think they have enough circumstantial evidence that they will try to make a case against him and bring him to trial sometime in the future. I think the main reason they decided to charge him with abduction first was the fear that if Ronald was deported back to Bolivia, they would never see him again. So this was a way to keep him incarcerated in the United States while they continue to gather evidence and build a case against him. So hopefully sometime within the next year, they do recover Bethany's remains and have a conclusive ending to this case. And another question which was asked by Joe is, which of your cases do you think are least likely to ever be solved? Well, the obvious answer to that question is some of the older mysteries that I've covered that took place around the early stages of the 20th century. I mean, right a couple weeks ago, I released an episode about the missing postman of Stradbally, the disappearance of Larry Griffin, which took place in Ireland in 1929. And since everyone involved in that case is now dead, I think the chances are pretty remote that they're going to recover Larry Griffin's remains and conclusively solve that case. So I think a lot of the older ones are never going to be solved, but I still think that they were interesting enough to cover on the podcast. But other cases I've covered which will probably never be conclusively solved are ones in which someone died under mysterious circumstances and their death was ruled to be an accident or suicide, but their loved ones were convinced that foul play had taken place. And in some of the cases I've covered, I do believe that the family was correct and that there was foul play. But there are others, such as the Ray Rivera case, which was covered on the Netflix reboot of Unsolved Mysteries, where I actually think the official explanation was correct and that there was no foul play. And if that's the case, you cannot technically solve the case because you can never, conclusively find out if the Ray took his own life or not. So, it's in those type of situations, I think it's pretty much impossible to solve the case if there was no crime and there's no one that you can arrest. So, I guess I would classify those ones as unsolvable as well. And our next question is from Bethany asking, which case are you most proud of to have helped solve? Well, I wouldn't say that I've helped solve any cases. I've done my part by getting them out there on the podcast and getting their story out there, but I wouldn't say that they've played a big role in officially getting the case solved. I mean, that was the job of the investigators. But I sometimes do feel a sense of pride when I cover a rather obscure case, which has otherwise not gotten a lot of coverage, and then it suddenly winds up being solved. And a prime example of that would probably be the 1996 murder of Jessica Bagan, which took place in Sitka, Alaska. That is not a case which got a lot of coverage at the time outside of Alaska, but I decided to cover it because it was requested from a listener who lived in the area. Well, in August of this past year, they wound up conclusively solving the crime by using DNA testing to link the evidence to a suspect named Steve Branch, who subsequently killed himself before he could be arrested. But because of the DNA evidence, they are now 100% certain that he was the killer, so this case is officially closed. And I still remember getting so many messages and emails when this news broke because, as far as I can tell, my podcast was the only one that had ever covered the case. And back before this news broke, if you Googled Jessica Bagan's name, one of the first matches you'd get would be my podcast episode. So I think that's where a lot of people found it to learn more information about it. What's interesting is that another suspect named Robert Bingham was actually charged for the crime back in 1996, but when he went on trial, he wound up being acquitted because none of the DNA or the other evidence matched him. And shortly after the case was solved, I actually received a nice email from Bingham's original defense attorney from his trial, who was very complimentary towards my episode and actually said that I got the facts of the case impressively correct. And I won't give any specific details because I want to protect this person's privacy, but I did hear from someone who played a role in helping solve this case who did tell me that they listened to my podcast episode for inspiration and said that it helped a lot because it made a lot of the events seem more real to them. So I don't know if I would consider that playing a role in helping solve this crime, but I'm glad I told Jessica's story before this case was officially solved. And our next question is from Rupert, who asks, do you have another update episode in the works for some time in the near future? Yes, I definitely do. I'm not entirely sure when I'm going to be releasing it. I debated doing an update episode to cap off 2020, but I ultimately decided to do a Q&A episode instead. But an update episode is definitely in the works because we've had a lot of developments in more cases since I released the original update episode 1 year ago. Of course, we've had a resolution in the Jessica Bagan case, we've had a big development recently in the Bethany Decker case, and of course some major news in the Janelle Matthews case, which I will talk about later on in this episode. And another interesting crime to talk about will be the murder of Harold and Thelma Swain, which I covered on the podcast in July of 2018. And at the time, a suspect named Dennis Perry was sitting in prison for committing those two murders. But shortly after I released my episode about the case, the podcast Undisclosed devoted an entire season to the case and helped play a role in getting new DNA testing for Dennis Perry, which did not match him. And he was finally released from prison this past summer. So you can bet I'm going to talk more about that one when I release my update episode sometime in the future. So our next question is from Matt, which reads, which case that you've investigated, though not necessarily covered on The Trail Went Cold, has had the most anticlimactic resolution? Well, in general, I think that most resolutions to cold cases are not anticlimactic because at least they provide closure. But there's one case in particular where the punishment certainly did not fit the crime. Back in my original Q&A episode in 2018, I was asked which Unsolved Mysteries case was I most happy to see solved, and my answer to that question was the disappearances of Wendy Camp, her young daughter Cynthia Brito, and her sister-in-law Lisa Renee Krieger, who vanished in Oklahoma in 1992. The three of them vanished during a visit to Wendy's ex-husband, Chad No, and anyone who watched the original Unsolved Mysteries segment would say it was blatantly obvious that Chad, his mother Beverly No, and Chad's grandmother Ida were responsible for the disappearance of the three victims, but at the time, there just wasn't the evidence to prove it. Well, in 2013, everyone was shocked to learn that the remains of the three victims were found buried in a shallow grave on property belonging to the No family, and about a year later, Beverly No was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, though she ultimately decided to plead no contest, and as part of her plea deal, she was sentenced to 15 years in prison and 15 years probation, which seems awfully light considering the heinous nature of the crime, but the ultimate resolution is even worse. I was shocked to learn that for reasons I cannot fathom or understand, Beverly was released from prison in January of 2020, which means she technically only did 5 years for her involvement in a triple murder in which one of the victims was a 6-year-old child. And even though it seemed pretty obvious that Chad No was complicit in these murders, he has never been charged with anything or done any time in prison for his involvement in this crime. So the end result was the murder of 3 people and one of the perpetrators serving 5 years in prison for it, which is just ridiculous. I have no idea why they would let Beverly out for something like this, but as satisfying as it was to finally solve this case and recover the 3 victims and give them a proper burial, the fact that some truly evil people did not receive due punishment for this crime is just ridiculous. So ultimately, I hate to say this was a very anticlimactic resolution where you can solve a missing persons case, but the responsible parties do not get their just desserts for it. So this is obviously the case on Unsolved Mysteries that probably enrages me more than any other, so I just felt like mentioning it here. Our next question is from Aaron, which is what is your favorite solved case? Which is a very interesting and unique question that I had to think about for a while before I answered, but I ultimately settled on a case which I personally consider to be solved, but there's still debate about to this day about whether it is unsolved or not, and that's the McDonald family murders. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this story, but it involves an army physician named Jeffrey MacDonald, who wound up being convicted of the brutal murders of his wife Colette and their two young daughters, Kimberly and Kristen. But to this day, 50 years later, MacDonald still maintains that he was railroaded and that a group of drug-addicted hippies broke into his home and attacked him and murdered his entire family, and that he's completely innocent. Well, even though I've ultimately reached the conclusion that MacDonald is guilty and he's a sociopath and is exactly where he belongs, there's still debate and controversy surrounding this case to this day, which is why I find it so fascinating, because there have been a number of books and podcasts and TV specials that have released a pro-innocent stance against MacDonald, and there are even a lot of people who believe that him being guilty or innocent does not even matter because they believe that the original investigation was botched and he did not receive a fair trial. And what makes this case so unique is that for many years there was another person named Helena Stokely who confessed on numerous occasions that she was inside the MacDonald home with some of her friends and that they committed the murders, but she would often recant her confessions, and because she had serious drug and mental health issues, most people believe that she was a very unreliable witness and was completely fabricating the story. But because of this, there's always been this ambiguity, people wondering, was MacDonald, did he actually do this, or was he railroaded and wrongly convicted for a crime he did not commit? I mean, I've been fascinated by this case for many, many years, and there was even a time period where I considered the possibility that MacDonald might actually be innocent. But ultimately, if you look at all the physical evidence, you'll realize that MacDonald's story about what happened could not have unfolded like he said. It just does not fit the evidence, and that he was the sole perpetrator of these brutal and horrible murders. But all that being said, there seems to be a renewed fascination into this case and the whole concept of family annihilators in general in recent years, and I think that's because of the fascination with the Chris Watts murders, which took place in 2018, because you can draw a number of parallels between the two cases, but the key difference is that Chris Watts has confessed, whereas MacDonald has still maintained his innocence to this day and has never confessed and likely never will. So I think that even though I believe he is guilty, I think even after MacDonald passes away, there is still going to be debate about this case until the end of time. Our next question is from Joe, and he asks, which of your cases do you believe you most know the answer to, and which are the most baffling ones? Well, I'm particularly baffled by cases in which someone winds up dead under bizarre circumstances at a location they had no reason to be at, like the aforementioned Aileen Conway case. Other examples of this are the Blair Adams case, the Jonathan Luna case, the death of Judy Smith, and also the strange death of David Lewis, which I covered on the podcast earlier this year, where he vanished from his hometown of Amarillo, Texas, and then wound up being killed in a hit and run in Washington State at the other end of the country, and no one knows what he was doing there to begin with. That whole concept just completely fascinates me, where people just travel to these faraway locations they have no reason to be at, and then wind up dead. As far as cases where I most believe I know the answer, those would probably be cases where the police have a suspect in mind, but there just is not enough evidence to arrest them. But when you look at the whole picture, it just seems pretty obvious that they did it. And a prime example of this is the case I talked about a few moments ago, the disappearance of Bethany Decker, where I think it's pretty obvious that Ronald Roldan killed her, but until recently there was just not enough evidence to make an arrest. I will say that there are a few cases which I've covered where I have some inside information, which gives me a pretty good idea about what happened and who did it, but I'm unable to say anything publicly because the person believed to be responsible has never publicly been named as a suspect or person of interest from law enforcement. So whenever that happens, I don't use their name on the podcast at all, but there are a handful of cases I've covered where I'm pretty certain I know what happened, but like I said, the police just do not have enough evidence to make an arrest or publicly name the person they believe was responsible. And our next question is from Kimberly. Do you think that Jewel Kaler will ever find peace with salad bars? Ah, yes, Jewel Kaler. That's a convenient segue because I was just talking about cases where I believed I knew the answer about who did it. So in case you're not familiar with this story, it involves the 1985 disappearance of a woman named Dottie Kaler, where her estranged husband, Jewel Kaler, was a person of interest. And Jewel wound up living in infamy when he did an interview on the Unsolved Mysteries segment about the case, where he acted pretty nonchalant and almost glad that Dottie was missing, and closed off his interview with the famous line that ever since Dottie disappeared, things are really pretty good. That salad bar reference is in reference to a story that I shared on my Trail Went Cold episode about the case, where apparently Jewel once went into Wendy's back when they had salad bars and made such a mess of it that he wound up being kicked out. And in retaliation, Jewel wound up writing an 8-page letter to Wendy's talking about how great he was at constructing salads and how insulted he was that they kicked him out. And he even enclosed a photograph of himself with a freshly constructed salad in order to prove his point. And that's become kind of a running joke between myself and many of my listeners because it is truly one of the most bizarre things I've ever heard of. That's pretty much the holy grail of materials I want to get a hold of related to cases I've covered, because I'd give anything to see this photograph of Jewel with the salad and read his entire 8-page letter, because I cannot imagine how you could fill 8 pages talking about how great you are at constructing salads. But Jewel is definitely a weird dude, and I truly hope, I know that Wendy's doesn't have salad bars anymore, but if they do, I hope that Jewel has truly found peace with them after all these years. And our next question is from Allison from the Resolved Mysteries podcast, which, if you haven't heard of, covers a lot of cases from Unsolved Mysteries. And she asks, if you could have dinner with 5 living people, who would they be? Well, my number one choice would obviously be Jewel Kaler at a Wendy's salad bar. Okay, just kidding. I'll answer that question seriously. Well, I'm one of those lucky people who has actually had dinner with some of my favorite true crime podcasters, so I've been pretty lucky in that respect. So I'm going to move into fields that I have other interests in besides true crime. I guess if you ask me this question on any different day, I might give different answers. But for now, I'm thinking of people who not only work in a field that I'm interested in, but are truly passionate about it and would probably have interesting conversations with. I'm a big movie fanatic, and one guy I would love to have dinner with is Quentin Tarantino, not only because I love his movies, but because he is such a film geek himself with an encyclopedic knowledge of movies, so I'm sure we would have some very interesting conversations. And another director I would love to talk with is Steven Spielberg, because he is responsible for some of my all-time favorite movies and has done pretty much everything in Hollywood, so I would just love to chat with him and pick his brain and hear some stories. I'm a big hockey fan, so I would obviously love to have dinner with the great one, Wayne Gretzky, who's pretty much a Canadian icon. I'm also a huge pro wrestling fan, and if he was still with us, my number one choice would be the legendary manager/announcer, Bobby the Brain Heenan, but unfortunately he passed away a couple years ago, but I would have given anything to hang out with him and to have dinner. But I guess my second choice would probably be Jim Cornette. He's a former wrestling manager slash promoter who is one of the best storytellers in the wrestling business and is known for his angry rants a lot of the time, but he just has such a fascinating knowledge of the wrestling business that if he was in a good mood, I'd like to sit down and have dinner with him and pick his brain. And I guess my fifth choice might be the crew of the TV show Mystery Science Theater 3000, which I'm going to talk about more later on, but I'm such a fan of that show and a fan of B-movies in general, and knowing how many terrible B-movies these guys have covered on their show, I would just like to sit around and chat with them about movies in general, and they seem like really nice guys too, really nice, laid-back, down-to-earth guys, so I think that having dinner with Mike Nelson and Joel and all the others would just be a major treat. So our next question is variations of the same question, which was asked once again by Allison and another listener named Christy. The variations are, if you could have dinner with anyone throughout history, who would they be? And if you could speak to one person in the history of time that has passed on, who would you choose? Well, this answer is not going to surprise anyone, but I'd have to go with the late, great Robert Stack. because it's pretty much the best of both worlds with him. You could have dinner and chat about Hollywood and movies, and also true crime, because before he was even asked to host Unsolved Mysteries, Robert Stack had a very long and storied career in Hollywood, so just talking to him about that would be interesting enough. But being able to talk about his experience hosting Unsolved Mysteries would be incredibly fascinating, and I would just love to hear some of his personal opinions about some of the cases that he covered. Because I know he had to remain neutral and non-biased while he was narrating, but I'd really be curious to know his opinions on stuff like the Dottie Kaler case, where it seems pretty obvious that one of the people who was interviewed killed her, and I'd love to know what he thought trying to narrate those segments in a very non-biased way. And we know that he was never a fan of narrating a lot of the paranormal and supernatural themed segments and would sometimes rant about it. So I'd like to hear some of his thoughts on that as well. And everyone who knew him said he was a very kind, charming, and nice guy. So it sounds like it would be a blast to be able to talk to him. So yeah, if I could go back in history and have dinner with Robert Stack at one point, I would definitely jump at the opportunity. And our next question is from Rupert, asking, if you could go back in time to experience a different time period, when would it be and why? Well, I would probably pick the 1970s. Technically, I was born in 1978, but I didn't get to experience much of it or remember it too well. But even though it sounds like it was a pretty tumultuous time, it was also a very fascinating time where a lot of world-changing events were taking place. Some of my favorite films of all time were made during the 1970s. I think it's such an important time for cinema because there was a lot more creative freedom for filmmakers where they did not have to worry as much about box office and just have their own creative freedom to make the films that they wanted. So this led to the creation of great films like The Godfather and Taxi Driver, Network, and Chinatown. So I would have loved to have been alive and experienced a lot of these films in a cinema when they originally came out, and also a lot of the big blockbusters that came out during that time period, like Jaws and Star Wars: A New Hope. And from a true crime perspective, it was also sounds like it was a pretty scary time, since serial killers were pretty rampant during the 1970s. I think that's when they were pretty much at their peak, but it would have been interesting to follow the true crime news during that time period. So yeah, if there's one period I would just like to go back and experience and live through, it would probably be the 1970s. Our next question is from Christy, saying, if you could visit one place in the world, where would it be? Well, I'm lucky enough to have traveled to some interesting places in North America and Europe, but I've never been to Asia or Australia, so I would probably put Australia number one on the top of my list, which is appropriate because I believe Christy, the person who asked this, is from Australia, but it seems like such an interesting and fascinating place that I hope to travel down there at some point and experience it. And I guess my second choice would probably be Japan. I know my father is a pilot he's a retired captain from Air Canada, so he's been to Japan numerous times, and unfortunately I never got to go with him, but I would like to travel there at some point and experience it for myself. So our next question is from David, who asks, what was the most interesting case you covered, and what was the most troubling case you covered? Well, the answer to the first question for most interesting is obviously the Tommy Ziegler case. I've mentioned many times how fascinating I find it, but the most troubling is a case that I've talked about many times before, and I think it's an obvious answer, and that's the murder of Jodine Sarin, which I covered on the podcast in February of 2018. In case you've never heard that episode before, Jodine Sarin was a 39-year-old woman who had some mental disabilities, and even though she could live on her own in her own condo, her parents still had to check in on her every now and then. And one year at Valentine's Day, they went to Jodine's condo, and she went on to answer the door. So they walked in and went to her bedroom and were shocked to discover that it appeared that a man was having sex with her on the bed. They were embarrassed, so they just told the guy to put his clothes back on and said to Jodine that we will wait in the living room until he's gone. But a couple minutes passed and Jodine had not emerged, so her parents decided to go back into the bedroom and discovered that not only was the man gone, he had snuck out through the back, but Jodie was actually dead and had been strangled to death. And the most horrifying aspect of this story is that Jodine was already dead when this man was assaulting her on the bed, and her parents did not even realize it while they witnessed this horrifying ordeal. So the crime is just so insane that I was really hoping it would be solved, and thankfully, because of genetic genealogy, several months after the episode was released, DNA testing conclusively identified her killer as a man named David Mabrito, but because he had killed himself many years earlier, they could not make an arrest. But because of the DNA evidence, they are 100% certain that he was the perpetrator. But yeah, that case is just so awful on so many levels, and I'm very relieved that it has been solved and that we now know that the person responsible is no longer out there hurting other people, because this was truly an horrific and troubling crime. Our next question is from Christy, and it's, what case, solved or unsolved, do you find the most disturbing, horrific, or heinous? Well, one that really stands out, which is pretty much the one case that I've received requests to cover, but I'm not sure if I'll ever do because the subject matter is just too disturbing, and that's the unsolved disappearance of Brittany Wood, which took place in Alabama in 2012. At the time, Brittany was only 19 years old and went missing after last being seen going to visit her uncle, and a few days later, her uncle wound up being found dead of what was believed to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Well, over the course of the next few months, several members of Brittany's families wound up being arrested for sex crimes, and it turned out that there was rampant sexual abuse in that family, which had been carrying on for generations. And you read the details about it, and it's absolutely sickening, and it's strongly suspected that Brittany may have been murdered because she was going to go to the authorities and blow the whistle on the whole thing. But this is the one case where once I received a request to cover it and started doing some research into it, I thought to myself, I'm not sure I can do this because the story involves pretty graphic sexual abuse of children and also incest and a whole bunch of other horrific stuff. So if I do decide to cover it someday, I would definitely have to be in the right frame of mind because this is probably one of the most horrific cases I've ever seen, and I admire any YouTuber or podcast that is able to cover it because the details of it are just so disturbing. So our next question is from Allison of the Resolve Mysteries podcast, and it's, is podcasting your full-time job? Actually, it's not. If you actually do a Google search on my name, you'll find an article that was published on Medium.com nearly 3 years ago titled Public Servant by Day, True Crime Podcaster by Night, which talks about my balancing act of working for the Canadian government during the day while doing a podcast on the side. My current job is working for Global Affairs Canada, so I am employed by the Canadian government. I have thought about the possibility of making podcasting my full-time gig, but I must say at this particular moment, I'm very glad that I am still working for my government job because it's been very useful to have it during this pandemic when the whole world has gone to hell because of COVID-19 and a lot of people have wound up being unemployed. At the moment, I am currently working my global affairs job from home on my laptop. I'm lucky enough to do that, so I don't have to commute and can keep myself quarantined. So I'm really glad that I held on to that job and can still do that and balancing out podcasting on the side. I do like my job. It involves pretty much like taking care of our department's records. My official title is Records Management Officer. So it's a very enjoyable job, but while I'm working it, I still get the yearning to do research on true crime and other stuff like that and do freelance writing, which is why I decided to start a podcast on the side and live this double life. Next, we have variations on the same question from listeners Christy and Lisa, so I'm going to read them both here. What is an average day like for you when you're not working on the podcast? And also, how in the world do you have time to do all that you do? Weekly podcast, get vocal sessions, unsolved mysteries viewing parties, etc. What is a day in the life of Robin Warder like? You never seem to take breaks. Well, like I mentioned a few moments earlier, I'm currently working my day job from home right now, so without having to commute, that actually gives me more time to focus on podcast-related stuff, and that's why I started the Get Vocal channel, and I'm doing more Unsolved Mysteries viewing parties, because these things are very good to do during the pandemic because of social distancing. I can't go out too much, and most people I know can't do that. So it's a great way to have a social get together and interact with my listeners and fellow true crime fanatics without having to leave my apartment. So I felt that's been a good way to prevent myself from feeling isolated while this pandemic is going on. I currently live alone, so unlike some other podcasters out there, I do not have kids, and I know that can be a major challenge for a lot of them because some of them have to have their kids do their schooling from home, so it can be a challenge to be able to maintain a podcast and your family at the same time, but I'm kind of in the opposite situation where I can use this additional time I have right now to work on podcast stuff and try to be more active with my listeners. But I don't work 24/7. I do have a lot of hobbies, which I'll talk about momentarily. But I do spend a lot of my downtime watching movies or TV series or professional sports. I know that during this pandemic, there has been some long periods where there weren't no sports, but I filled in the time by watching old baseball games on YouTube. And I'm also a big wrestling fan, so I've been watching old wrestling events. So that's what I do when I'm not working my day job or the podcast. I just kind of relax and unwind and watch stuff during my downtime. And our next question is from Keith. My question is if you could give the audience some metrics of how successful the podcast is. Subscribers, downloads, whatever. Well, I can't really give you too many specifics. I know that the pandemic has wound up skewing the numbers a little bit because I'm sure most podcasts I know have had a drop in downloads since it began. But to give you an idea, we're probably not in the top tier of podcasts as far as downloads go, but we do pretty well for ourselves. And I kind of had this shocking moment the first year I did The Trail Went Cold, where for the first 8 or 9 months, we didn't really have any devices that measured our downloads. I had nothing to base on how well we were doing except for the hits that our Trail Went Cold website received. And we would get maybe a couple hundred per day and maybe over 1,000 on the day that we dropped a new episode. But then when we hooked up to some software which showed the downloads we were getting, we were taken by complete surprise. Because this was shortly after we were featured in a BuzzFeed article about true crime podcasts, and that was a big break for us and gave us a lot of additional exposure and put us on the iTunes charts for a while. So we wound up picking up a whole slew of listeners during that time period, and I remember looking at the downloads on the first day that we dropped a new episode and saw that we were getting something between 6,000 or 7,000 after a few hours, which at that time was way over my expectations. I was blown away that many people were listening to the podcast. But I think I'm just kind of a fortunate person who experienced a lot of luck that I got in relatively early on the true crime podcasting phase in early 2016. Before there was a major boom, and it allowed me to kind of break free from the pack and build a new audience. Whereas if you start a new true crime podcast today, the market is so saturated and there's so many podcasts out there that it's much tougher to stand out and build an audience. But back in early 2016, there weren't nearly as many. So a podcast about cases from unsolved mysteries seemed to appeal to a lot of people, and it turned out pretty well for us. Our next question is from Matt. What can you tell us about the finances of a podcast? What are the expenses that you didn't expect when you started? Well, for starters, I'll say that you don't need a ton of money if you're starting your own independent podcast. When you're starting out, you don't need to build like this fancy studio or get fancy equipment. All you really need is a laptop, a microphone, a good quality microphone, and some audio recording software and editing software. And as long as it sounds good, that's all you really need. You don't have to go all out spending money because obviously most podcasts that start out are not going to be making a lot of money from listeners and may never make money. It's something you have to do because you have a passion for it. But you do have to spend money in order to maintain it because we have a website, we have to pay for hosting fees, and I also have to pay money to do research. I have a subscription to newspapers.com, and sometimes I purchase books in order to use them as research, and sometimes you have to pay in order to get official case documents. So it can be something where you wind up getting more expenses than you expected if you're doing a deep dive into a cold case. I mean, there's a lot of information you can just find on the internet, but if you want to really get to the nuts and bolts of the case, you will probably have to spend money to obtain that information. And also on Patreon, you do make money when listeners donate to you, but you also have to spend money on sending out cards and merchandise, so you're not going to make a boatload at first. But that's a lesson you pretty much say to all aspiring podcasters today. There may be some point in the future when you do make money, but when you start off and are just trying to build an audience, you're not going to see much money, if any at all, so don't expect to get rich doing this venture. But at the same time, if you're passionate about it and you just want to do it because you love it, not because you're going to make a lot of money, just make sure you don't put yourself into heavy debt for it. Don't ring up a lot of expenses so that you're losing a lot of money while you're releasing your podcast. You need to find that happy medium. And our next question is from Christy. How do you foresee the Trail Went Cold going? Is it something you plan on doing indefinitely? Would you consider a spin-off series or perhaps a long-form investigative podcast based on a single case? Well, that's the thing with true crime, is that there are never a shortage of cases to cover, which is not a good thing for the world in general, but I know that I will probably never run out of material to produce episodes of The Trail Went Cold. As many of you might know, before I started the podcast, I spent many years writing freelance for Cracked and Listverse.com, and a lot of the time I would compile lists about unsolved mysteries and cold cases, and I would make a list of them and keep track of them and figure I will cover this one on the podcast someday. And that's kind of the way it works, is that I have so many cases that I want to cover that I start thinking to myself, even if I do this podcast for 20 years, I may never get to do all the cases that I truly want to do, because not only are there ones that I want to do, I often receive requests from listeners about cases that I've never heard about, so I can keep producing episodes for a long time, and I hope to do it as long as I can, but you just never know what the future of podcasting will hold. Will true crime podcasting will go out of style? There'll be a new medium to replace it. You just never know. But as long as I keep my passion for it, I haven't really lost my drive in order to produce these episodes. I will continue to produce new content for The Trail Went Cold. And as far as the second question about doing a spin-off series or a long-form investigative podcast based on a single case, I have thought about that possibility. If I did, it would probably have to come at a situation where I'm not working my government job, because a long-form investigative podcast requires a lot of work. So, and for the moment, with the world and the state it's in because of COVID-19, I still want to hold on to my regular job and do the podcast on the side. I guess my biggest obstacle about doing an investigative podcast based on a single case is that, like I mentioned earlier, there are just so many cases I want to cover. So I often wonder to myself, would I really be prepared to make the commitment to focus on one single case for a long period of time? I mean, it's certainly possible, but at the moment, at least, I'm content to continue on with the format of doing a different case every week, because there are just so many stories out there which haven't been covered that I'm still hoping to do. Our next question is from Kimberly. Have you ever considered writing a book with collected Trail Went Cold stories? You've created lists in a podcast. I would buy the book. Well, thank you very much, Kimberly. I have been asked that question quite a few times and have thought about it. I think over the past 5 years, I've written so many scripts for the cases that I've covered on The Trail Went Cold. I mean, that's the thing with my episodes, is I don't do anything off the cuff. Everything is scripted to the max. So I have transcripts of every single episode that I've done over the past 5 years. So it would be a lot of material for a book. So I have considered the possibility. I have no idea how I would get started on that. And I don't know what kind of editing would have to be done for legal reasons, if I'd have to leave my personal opinions out of the scripts that I present on the episodes if I wouldn't be able to release that in a book. But I definitely have a lot of material to work with, and maybe when the world becomes normal again and I have more time to focus on something like this, it is something that I would consider, because I think there is a big enough audience out there who would possibly buy it. Our next question is from David. How does it make you feel when you read comments on social media about how we all read what you post in your voice? Yes, I have heard that quite a bit, where I will write a post on my Facebook page or in my discussion group, and people will say, I totally visualized you reading this in your voice. But it doesn't bother me at all. I actually take it as a huge compliment that people recognize my voice so much that that instantly will pop into their mind when they see something that I've written. And sometimes I totally poke fun of that. I will do like fake status updates in the form of the opening of The Trail Went Cold. So I'm willing to have fun with myself for that reason. But that's kind of the weird thing with podcasting, is that you become so familiar with people's voices that it's almost a surreal moment when you meet them for the first time face to face. I know that happened the first time I attended CrimeCon in Indianapolis. I was in a room with maybe 30 or 40 other podcasters, and most of them I was familiar with their voices, and I instantly recognized them. So matching a face to the voices for all these people at the same time was quite a surreal experience. And a lot of people say that to me when they meet me at these podcasting events, saying, wow, it's so weird to finally see a face with this voice that I've heard for so long. But I still take it as a huge compliment. Our next question was sent in by both Diana and Rupert. What do your coworkers and family think of your podcast? Do they listen to it? My family definitely listens to the podcast and are 100% supportive of it. Obviously, my parents are not true crime fanatics, but they still find the whole venture very, very interesting, so they've listened to a lot of my episodes. And they've actually come to a couple of my live podcasting shows. In 2018 and 2019, I was part of two true crime podcasting events put together by Christy Lee of Canadian True Crime, where we did a show in a downtown bar with a live Q&A. And the year after that, we actually did a live podcasting event at the Royal Cinema in downtown Toronto, which was a pretty big deal. And my parents went to both of these events. And like I said, even though true crime is not one of their primary interests, they found it infinitely fascinating and interesting. So if they weren't true crime fans before, I've definitely helped turn them into one. So I take a lot of pride in that. And speaking of family, I also have a funny story about one of my cousins named Jessie. A couple years ago, she was living in Tasmania, Australia, and she listens to the podcast quite a bit. And she met some friends down there, and they got onto the subject of true crime podcasts, and The Trail Went Cold finally entered the conversation, and she mentioned that she was Robin Warder's cousin. And apparently the reaction was, "What? The host of The Trail Went Cold is your cousin?" And that pretty much just blew my mind, that people were listening to my show all the way down under in Australia, and that they almost kind of considered me some form of celebrity and were just blown away by the fact that one of their friends was the cousin of Robin Warder. So that's just one of the most overwhelming things you can hear when you become a podcast host. As far as coworkers go, most of my coworkers who have listened to it are supportive. It's not something I really advertise a lot. I just kind of casually mention it at work, and sometimes my coworkers all think it's pretty interesting. I don't know how many of them actually have listened to the show, but some have listened to it and told me that they liked it, which is good. And if any of them disliked it, they never told me so. And the good news is that no one has ever attempted to report me to HR under the suspicion that I'm a serial killer or something. So I guess I'll take that as a good sign. But yeah, I will definitely say that the support from my family, coworkers, and friends about the podcast has always been pretty great. And I'm pretty proud of that. And our next question is from Michelle, and it's, if you could have the powers of any superhero, which would you choose? Well, if I wanted a power, it would probably be some sort of post-cognitive vision, because as someone who has a fascination with cold cases and unsolved mysteries, I would legitimately like to be a psychic. I mean, I'm really skeptical about psychics in general, but the idea of being able to use your powers in order to find out the solutions for unsolved crimes is just something that I would really love to have if it was an ability that was real. I'm probably making a really obscure reference here, but growing up in Canada during the 1980s, I used to watch a program called Seeing Things, which was about an investigative journalist who lived in Toronto who would help solve murders with his post-cognitive visions. He would go to a crime scene and suddenly have these visions about what happened, which would give him clues, and they would ultimately lead to him solving the murders. There might be one or two other people out there listening to this who have actually remember that show and watched it, and if you do, I'm mightily impressed. But as a kid, I used to love watching that growing up, and was one of my earliest interests in true crime. So yeah, I would like to be in a situation like that where I could help solve crimes just through my psychic visions of some sort. But the downside of that is that I would not be able to host The Trail Went Cold, because if I had the ability to find out the solutions and the answers to all these mysteries, then I couldn't really do a podcast about them because those mysteries would be solved. So I guess it's kind of a catch-22. So it's probably a good thing that I'm not a superhero and that I don't have any powers. So our next question is from Jane, who asks, I'd love to know if you have any hobbies and or interests other than the wonderful investigative reporting you do. Was there an event in your life that led you to want to do investigative reporting? Well, like I mentioned earlier, I am a huge movie fanatic, so that's one of my primary hobbies, and that's how I spend a lot of my downtime, just watching some of my favorite movies. I have a very large collection of DVDs and Blu-rays, and I even have some old leftover VHSs from many years ago, because I actually still have a functional VCR. I'm also a big fan of baseball, which I'll talk more about momentarily, and I'm also a huge hockey fan, and also a big fan of professional wrestling. So I have no shortage of hobbies to make up my spare time when I'm not working on the podcast or focusing on true crime. And I wouldn't say there's one event in my life that led me to want to do investigative reporting or a podcast, but I kind of had this moment of clarity so many years ago, being such a huge Unsolved Mysteries fan, when I started researching some of the cases they featured on the show over the internet, and often find out that there was a lot more information available about these cases than what was presented on the TV show. So that's where a light bulb went over my head, where I would come up with some sort of media where I would look at Unsolved Mysteries cases and do a deep dive into them and kind of provide more information than you learned on the show. And I mentioned earlier that we had originally wanted it to be a YouTube series where I actually appeared on camera dressed like Robert Stack and used Unsolved Mysteries clips to talk about them. But it eventually evolved into the idea of doing a podcast, which wouldn't just do Unsolved Mysteries cases, but do cold cases and mysteries from all over. And here we are still going 5 years later, so obviously the idea turned out pretty well. Our next question is from Donna, who asks, what is your favorite baseball team, and who is your all-time favorite baseball player? Well, living in Canada, my all-time favorite baseball team is the Toronto Blue Jays. Been a fan since childhood, though I will say that my second favorite team is the Chicago Cubs. I've always been a huge fan of theirs as well, and it was such a major moment when they finally won the World Series in 2016 and broke the 108-year drought. And I should mention that when I attended the True Crime Podcast Festival in Chicago last summer, I had to take the opportunity to go to Wrigley Field and check out a Cubs game because it's such a unique atmosphere and is something everyone should do at least once in their lifetime. And as far as my all-time favorite baseball player, that would probably be former Toronto Blue Jays player Joe Carter, for reasons that will become obvious momentarily. Carter was a pretty huge star in the early 1990s with the Blue Jays, and one reason I always like him in addition to his skills is because he always came across as a hell of a nice guy. Whenever you saw him interviewed, he would always be very upbeat and very positive, and he just seemed to have a great attitude. And it's also a bonus that he turned out to be a great player as well, so he was definitely my favorite growing up. But of course, there's one primary reason why Joe Carter will always be my all-time favorite, and that leads us to our next question. The question is from Mike. I heard in the One Unsolved Mysteries bonus episode on the Final Appeal tier that you mentioned you were at Game 6 of the World Series when Joe Carter hit his epic home run. Can you tell us about experiencing that World Series game? Also, have there been any other sporting events that you have attended that have been particularly meaningful that you care to share? Well, in case you're not a baseball fan, one of the most memorable moments of all time took place in Game 6 of the 1993 World Series, where the Blue Jays were down 6-5 in the bottom of the ninth inning before Joe Carter hit a 3-run home run to win the World Series and give the Blue Jays their second consecutive World Series title. And I was lucky enough to attend that game when I was 15 years old, and I just got incredibly lucky and everything fell perfectly into place. Because back in 1993, there was barely even an internet, so you couldn't order your tickets that way. And the way the Toronto Blue Jays organized things is that they would not take phone orders or walk-up sales as well. So if you wanted to buy postseason tickets, you would have to clip out an order form from the newspaper, send it in along with a money order, and then just hope for the best. And I know that in 1993, my family and I attended a game of the American League Championship Series, which is the round before the World Series, and it was a pretty disappointing game because I believe the Jays lost to the White Sox 6-1, so we wanted to try again when they made it to the World Series. And if I recall correctly, Game 6 wasn't even our first choice. I believe we originally requested tickets to Game 1 because the way it works out is that we couldn't even be certain that there would be a Game 6. It was possible that the series was going to be over by that time. So I think Game 6 was our second choice, and we wound up receiving the tickets and just hoped that it would play out. And what's ironic is that the Blue Jays were actually ahead 3-1, and if they had won Game 5 in Philadelphia, they would have clinched the series, and there would have been no Game 6, and I wouldn't be able to attend. So I actually recall cheering for the Phillies in Game 5 when I was watching it on television. I just wanted them to win that once to extend the series so that I would be able to attend Game 6 2 nights later. And luckily they did. I recall that Curt Schilling pitched a complete game shutout to clinch a Phillies victory. So my family and I attended the game at the Sky Dome, and we actually had seats in the front row of the upper 500 level in left field, and there's one moment in the television broadcast where you can briefly see us for only a few seconds from a distance. We had brought a banner to hang up over the side, and you can kind of see it, but it's so small that you wouldn't be able to tell it was us, but we are there on camera for a brief split second during the ninth inning. So the way the game played out is that the Jays took an early lead and were up 5-1 going into the seventh inning, and it seemed like it was a cinch that they were going to win the World Series that night. But then they blew the lead and gave up 5 runs in the top of the seventh, so things got really tense until the bottom of the ninth when Joe Carter hit his game-winning home run, and it was just absolute bedlam there when it happened. And my initial reaction was just pure shock because if you're not a baseball fan, this is an extremely rare occurrence. It was only the second time in the history of Major League Baseball where someone has ended a World Series on a walk-off home run. The other time took place in 1960, and this event has not taken place since then, so it was just pure pandemonium, and you could just see the pure joy in Joe Carter as he was rounding the bases and leaping in the air, because this is a childhood dream for everyone to hit a home run to win the World Series, but it so rarely ever happens. And of course, after we left the game, there was just celebration in the streets. It was just a pure once-in-a-lifetime moment, and I will be forever grateful that I got to experience it and attend that game. And the Blue Jays wouldn't have anything like that for a long time because they didn't even make the playoffs again for another 22 years, and they still have never won another World Series. As far as other sporting events I've attended, my family, our summer vacation used to be just traveling around America and visiting various baseball stadiums. So I've attended a lot of baseball stadiums throughout America and seen a whole lot of different teams. Another memorable game I went to was actually in 2016, the Game 3 of the Division Series between the Blue Jays and the Texas Rangers, where they actually clinched the series and won in the bottom of the 10th inning. So that was another exciting experience. I've also attended quite a few hockey games, and one that really stands out is I actually saw Wayne Gretzky's final game at Maple Leaf Gardens, though at the time I did not realize the significance. The game took place in December of 1998, and Wayne Gretzky retired at the end of the season in April of 1999. So by that point, he had not decided he was retiring, and this would be his last season. So I did not realize the significance, and it was only after he released a DVD set about his career a couple years later, and they had a section about his final game in Maple Leaf Gardens that with the New York Rangers that I finally realized the significance. And I know it was a special moment for Gretzky because he grew up a major Leafs fan, so I'm really grateful that I got to see one of his final games played in Canada. And also in April of 2019, I actually went to Montreal and saw a Montreal Canadiens Toronto Maple Leafs game that happened to be the last game of our legendary Hockey Night in Canada play-by-play announcer, Bob Cole, who retired following that game at the age of 85. And of course, I grew up listening to Bob Cole's voice watching hockey for so many years, so that was a pretty special moment to attend. They had a small tribute for him, and thankfully it was also a very exciting game as well. And being a wrestling fan, I've also attended a lot of ton of wrestling events in my time period, and I've actually been to 3 WrestleManias. I saw WrestleMania 6 and 18 in Toronto, and also WrestleMania 23 in Detroit. So I'm definitely very passionate about these hobbies and go to sporting events whenever I can. And a couple other questions from Mike. Did you play any sports growing up? Do you play any sports now? What type of exercise do you do? Are you more into cardio or weight training? How have your exercise habits changed since the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, unfortunately, even though I am a big sports fan, I am actually quite terrible at playing sports. The only time I ever played was in school whenever I had to take gym class, but my coordination and motor skills are terrible, so I would be completely useless at any sports, so that's why I was never a part of any team. So don't really have any interesting stories there. And I'm not much of an exercise person as either. I don't really work out or lift weights. I like to go for walks quite a bit. That's all I could really do during the pandemic, but other than that, most of my time is sitting down and researching and recording podcast episodes, which doesn't lend itself too well to physical activity, unfortunately, but I make do. So our next question is from John. Since you are a huge pro wrestling fan, have you ever thought about covering the unsolved murders of either Dino Bravo or Gino Hernandez? Would love your perspective on these unsolved cases. Well, I actually do get quite a few requests to cover that from wrestling fans, and I would like to do an episode about Dino Bravo at the very least, but the biggest obstacle is that there's so little information available about his crime. In case you're not a wrestling fan, Dino Bravo was a French-Canadian wrestler who was most famous for wrestling in the World Wrestling Federation in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But in March of 1993, he was shot several times inside his home in Quebec, and to this day, his murder is still unsolved. It was a pretty brutal crime, as he was shot a total of 17 times, and one of the most prominent theories is that he was involved in illegal cigarette smuggling and may have been killed by someone associated with the mob or organized crime. But the big problem is that that's pretty much all the information that's available about his murder. I mean, there's also been speculation that he was killed by someone he knew, but over the past 25 years or so, there have been virtually zero leads. No one has ever been publicly named as a suspect or a person of interest. And unfortunately, there really isn't all that much to talk about. And I don't even know if anyone is still actively investigating this case at all. I know that the documentary series Dark Side of the Ring did an episode about Dino Bravo earlier this year, and I was hoping to learn a lot more about the case. And well, it offered a lot of additional insight on Dino's life. It really didn't say all that much about the murder itself, and that's one of my biggest obstacles with doing cases on The Trail Went Cold, is if I can't really talk much about the crime and potential theories, then there's not really much I could say. And I know that I could definitely record an episode about Dino Bravo's career. I could probably talk for 45, 50 minutes about that, but the problem is that the majority of The Trail Went Cold's listeners are not wrestling fans, so I don't know how interesting they would find it. They would probably only be interested in hearing me talk about the crime itself, and unfortunately, there really isn't all that much to say, which is why I've resisted doing an episode about this case. Now, Gino Hernandez, he was a guy who found a lot of success wrestling in the Texas-based promotion World Class Championship Wrestling during the 1980s, but he also happened to be a heavy drug user, and he was found dead in February of 1986 in what was officially ruled to be a drug overdose, but there are some people within the wrestling business who don't buy that official story and believe that he was a victim of foul play. I know that Gino was friends with a notorious drug trafficker, and he was associated with a lot of people who were involved in crime, which is why there's a select group of people who believe that he was murdered. I could personally go 50-50. I'm not entirely convinced foul play took place here because he definitely had a serious drug problem, so I could see him being the victim of an overdose, but much like with Dino Bravo, this one was featured on the Dark Side of the Ring documentary series, but unfortunately it doesn't really offer too much insight on the crime itself, and I just don't know if there would be a lot to talk about if I did a podcast episode. Once again, I could probably do a lengthy episode talking about Gino Hernandez's wrestling career, but I don't know how many of my non-wrestling fan listeners would be interested in that, so it's almost like if I did a side project from the Trail Run Cold that was just about wrestling deaths, I could probably do some extensive episodes about this, but I don't know how I can make it fit into this particular podcast. So I don't know, I wouldn't completely rule out doing episodes on either of these cases, but at the moment I just find myself stuck when I try to write out a lengthy, extensive episode exploring their deaths. Our next question is from Matt, who asks, which case would you like to cover, but need just one or two more pieces of information to make it a viable episode? Well, one of those would obviously be Dino Bravo, but there's another case that I'm very intrigued by that I want to talk about here. Last year, I was asked by the nonprofit organization called Private Investigations for the Missing if I would be interested in writing a blog entry about an unsolved missing persons case for their website. So I decided to choose this really obscure case about a 14-year-old girl named Charlotte Loomis, who went missing in 1972 under very strange circumstances. She originally hailed from Michigan and was visiting her sister-in-law and brother in New Jersey. And the story goes that after she was dropped off at the airport in New Jersey, she inexplicably vanished without a trace, but apparently her luggage actually arrived at the airport in Michigan, but she didn't, so it's a big mystery. Did she actually board the plane in New Jersey and disappear after she landed, or did she check in her luggage, but something happened to her before she boarded the plane in New Jersey? It's a very baffling scenario, but unfortunately there is just so little information available about this case, which is why I decided to talk about it in my blog entry, because there's nowhere near enough to do a podcast episode. So this is one that I would like to dig into at some point and maybe try to find out more, because I feel that there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle missing here, that there's a lot of information that sheds a lot of light on what might have happened to her. But as it is, it's a mystery with a very intriguing hook about a girl who disappeared at an airport, but her luggage managed to survive. But what happened to her? But unfortunately, that's about as far as it goes, and I have no other information. But yes, if I can uncover any additional information about this, I would love to cover it on the podcast at some point. And now we're going to talk about variations of the same question, which were asked by Darren, Christy, and Mike, so I'm just all going to group them together now. One of them is, what Canadian musician or group do you wish more people knew of? What's your favorite band? What musical groups did you listen to growing up during the 80s and 90s? Besides Vince Nitro, what kind of music do you listen to now? Well, believe it or not, I'm not really a big music guy. I don't really follow any particular artists or groups. I'm the kind of guy who needs some sort of visual to associate with a song or a piece of music. Otherwise, it doesn't really mean anything to me. I mean, I'm a guy who listens to a lot of movie soundtracks, not just orchestral scores, but soundtracks that consist of songs. But the way I look at it is, if I hadn't heard these songs in the movie that I like, then they wouldn't mean anything to me individually. As an example, during the 1990s, I always used to listen to the soundtracks of all the Quentin Tarantino movies, But I mean, if I just listened to the songs on their own, they wouldn't have mean much to me. And same thing with listening to soundtracks of orchestral scores. I listen to Ennio Morricone soundtracks all the time, a lot more than I listen to groups or individual artists. It's just kind of the weird way my brain works. I'm kind of a visual person, so music itself doesn't really do a lot for me. And these days when I go on long road trips, I always listen to podcasts most of the time rather than music, so I can't really recommend anybody to you, unfortunately. Though I will say, growing up in the late 80s and early 90s, I listened to a lot of Weird Al Yankovic, and I technically still do, because I love the whole concept of parodies of music, and I love the fact that Weird Al Yankovic has wound up outliving a lot of the groups and artists that he satirized, and is still as strong as ever in 2020. But since you asked a question about Canadian musicians, I should mention that I grew up in a household when I was a kid that played a lot of Gordon Lightfoot music. And technically, Gordon Lightfoot is probably the first concert I ever attended, because my parents actually took me to a couple of his concerts during the 1980s. Because I had grown up listening to his songs, it kind of blew me away at the time to see him performing them live. Even though I was probably the only person in the audience who was under the age of 35, but still a pretty memorable experience. And hey, Gordon Lightfoot is still going strong and performing today, even though he's in his 80s. So if you're looking for a Canadian artist to recommend, I guess I'll go with Gordon Lightfoot, because he's still a legend. Our next question is from Tony, who asks, who is your favorite fictional detective? Well, I have a lot of interesting choices here. Believe it or not, I'm not really very much of a comic books guy, but in the early 90s, there was a period when I was obsessed with Dick Tracy comics. I loved the movie that came out in 1990 with Warren Beatty, and it got me interested in the comics, and I always found them really entertaining, so I guess you could call Dick Tracy my favorite cartoon detective. And I'm also a big fan of Eddie Valiant from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I think that Bob Hoskins is brilliant in the role, and I love the whole concept of a private investigator for toons who helps solve problems involving animated characters. Another recent favorite is probably the detective Benoit Blanc, played by Daniel Craig in the movie Knives Out, which came last year. I thought that movie was brilliant, and Daniel Craig was brilliant as well. And that big monologue he does about donut holes when he's solving the case, I think is hilarious, and I quote it all the time. I spoke in the car about the hole at the center of this donut, and yes, what you and Holland did that fateful night seems at first glance to fill that hole perfectly. A donut hole in the donut's hole. But we must look a little closer, and when we do, we see that the donut hole has a hole in its center. It is not a donut hole at all, but a smaller donut with its own hole, and our donut is not whole at all. Well, I guess when you sat down to listen to this podcast episode, you probably did not expect me to do a Daniel Craig impression with a southern accent, but there you go. Our next question is from Ian from the Frost Podcast, another Canadian true crime podcast, and he asks, what is the weirdest theory for a case you've done that has been sent to you? Well, I had to look through my old emails and think long and hard about this one, but believe it or not, I have gotten a few emails where people have suggested Bigfoot or Sasquatch as a potential theory. It's mostly for cases involving people who got lost in the wilderness, and I've seen it presented in the Henry McCabe case that I covered 3 years ago, because as you recall, that's about a guy who died under strange circumstances after leaving a strange voicemail that appeared to have a growling sound on there, so some people have speculated that he was attacked by Bigfoot. When I look at these people sending in these theories, I wonder if they're trolling or if it's a practical joke, but I still sometimes get the impression that maybe they are legitimately serious and believe that Bigfoot was the cause of these people's disappearance or unexplained death, but I guess it's inevitable. If you do a podcast about unsolved mysteries and cold cases, I think eventually you are going to get emails from listeners who believe that Bigfoot was responsible. Our next question is from Damien. It's pretty apparent that your favorite true crime show is Unsolved Mysteries. Other than this, what would you consider some of your other favorite shows of that time, true crime or not? Well, I'm a major Simpsons fanatic. I started watching The Simpsons when it first launched in 1989, and I never guessed that they would still be producing new episodes 30 years later. I mean, obviously the stuff they produced the last 2 decades is not as good as the episodes they produced during the 1990s. That is some of the best comedy ever produced, and I revisit those episodes over and over again and know most of them by heart. But even though I had not watched a new episode of The Simpsons in many, many years, I was pleasantly surprised that they did an entire episode recently which satirized true crime podcasts. The title of the episode is Podcast News, and I'd highly recommend tracking it down and watching it. While I was viewing it, my reaction was just like Homer Simpson when he said that immortal line, "It's funny 'cause it's true," because everything they did was dead on in their satire, and I totally identified with a lot of the jokes in that particular episode. I was also a big Seinfeld fanatic during the 1990s as well. I'm also a fanatic of Mystery Science Theater 3000, and I still watch the new episodes they produce on their Riff Track, and it's kind of one of my goals to go to one of their live shows someday. Some of the dramatic TV shows I was a big fan of was 24 with Jack Bauer. I was fanatical about that show when it aired during the early 2000s. Also a huge fan of The Shield. It's probably my favorite cop show of all time. And also Breaking Bad as well. Big fan of that too. As far as other true crime shows, I also really like Disappeared, which launched in, I believe, the late around 2009, 2010. I remember when I discovered it, I was just blown away because it was probably the closest thing you could find to a modern day unsolved mysteries. And a lot of the cases they covered on Disappeared have become quite famous, such as Maura Murray and the Springfield Three. So I like to consider that the closest modern day equivalent to unsolved mysteries. Our next question is from Tony. If they ever try to remake Unsolved Mysteries again, who would you like to see as host? Your listeners want you, of course. Well, thank you very much. That has happened ever since they announced the reboot of Unsolved Mysteries on Netflix. They said they should have hired me to be the host, and some people even tweeted my name to the next Netflix Twitter account when they first made this announcement, so I greatly appreciate the support. Truthfully, I know a lot of people were upset that the Netflix version of Unsolved Mysteries did not have a host, but I'm not entirely sure it needs one because Robert Stack was just truly one of a kind that I don't think anyone could adequately fill his shoes. Nobody could possibly do a show like that better than he did. So it would just be such a tough act to follow. But all that being said, I think they could use a narrator. Like, they don't necessarily need a host to appear on camera and introduce the segments. But I think the Netflix version would be improved if they had someone narrating to explain the events that were going on. I mean, obviously they wouldn't have to do it in as ominous a voice as Robert Stack did, but I think it would help the story flow better if they had a narrator to connect things rather than relying heavily on interview sound bites like most true crime shows do these days. I can think of a couple actors who have narrated true crime shows in the past who would probably do a good job. I know that Keith David has done some good narration in the past. Bruce Greenwood, a Canadian actor, has done quite a few narrations on some other true crime specials. He did a narration for a TV special about the Tommy Ziegler case called A Question of Innocence and did a really good job, so I think he would be good for this. I've even seen some people suggest Bill Curtis, who has narrated shows like American Justice and Cold Case Files. He's getting up there in age, but I would still love to hear him narrate if he could. But I guess the biggest obstacle is everyone considers Robert Stack to be irreplaceable. So whoever they got to host or narrate the Netflix reboot of Unsolved Mysteries would definitely be facing an uphill battle. So our next question is from Nisa. If the podcast was turned into a TV show, how would it be structured? Well, this is an interesting question because it's a good opportunity to talk about an influence that for The Trail Went Cold that I've never really discussed before, and that's a New Zealand true crime series called The Investigator, which aired, I think, between 2009 and 2012. I stumbled across it on YouTube several years ago, and it's hosted by a famous documentary filmmaker named Brian Bruce. And I was always intrigued by the format of it, in that he would talk about some famous cold cases or controversial cases which took place in New Zealand. Pretty much spend the first half of the episode going over the facts of the case, and then the second half he would break all the entire crime down and try to come up with some theories to explain about what happened. And as you probably know, that's the exact format that I use on The Trail Went Cold. I think I watched the episodes way back in 2012, 2013, and it kind of planted the original seeds in my head, where I thought about this idea, maybe I should do a series about where I go over famous unsolved cases from Unsolved Mysteries, where I spend the first half just going over the case itself, and the second half talking about theories. And it took a while, but this idea eventually became the Trail Went Cold podcast. So I would like to see another true crime show take up this format, because a lot of the time they just kind of go over the facts of the case, but they don't really break it down piece by piece to try to figure out what happened. So if The Trail Went Cold was turned into a TV show, I would like to see it follow that structure, where we would go over the case for the first half and then just try to break it down piece by piece, and at the very end try to come up with a conclusion to solve the mystery and figure out the most likely explanation for what happened. Episodes of The Investigator are kind of hard to track down today, but you can still find a few on YouTube, so I'd highly recommend checking it out. And if you watch it, you'll kind of see where the idea of The Trail Went Cold came from. Next, we have variations of the same question, which were sent in by Jen and Allison, and they are, what are your can't-miss podcasts, true crime or otherwise, and what are your top 5 favorite podcasts? Well, these days I don't really have much time to listen to anything but true crime podcasts. Since I have a lot of other interests, I would like to branch out and listen to more podcasts about film or sports or wrestling. But when you're working on your own podcast, one of the side effects is that you don't get as much time as you want to listen to other people's podcasts. I'll avoid listing my top 5 favorites just because I am friends with so many podcasters, so I don't want to cause any friction. But I will list quite a few that I try to listen to every now and then to new episodes because I'm such a fan. 2 of my biggest influences before I started The Trail Went Cold were obviously Generation Y. They're pretty much people who paved the way for the rest of us, and I still listen to their new episodes all the time. Even though they're not around anymore and aren't producing new episodes, Thinking Sideways was obviously one of my biggest influences because they covered unsolved mysteries. But there were so few podcasts to listen to when I started out in 2016, but a lot of other people who have become friends of mine have since produced their own, which have become major successes, such as Already Gone, The Vanished, Crime Lines, Canadian True Crime, Trace Evidence. Trace Evidence, if you're a fan of The Trail Went Cold, then this is definitely the podcast you will like, because Stephen Pacheco has told me that I helped influence him, and he follows the same format of covering the facts of the case and then breaking down potential theories, and he covers a lot of interesting cold cases, so I'd recommend that as well. I also listen to frequent episodes of True Crime Garage because they started around the same time I do, and they also cover a lot of unsolved cold cases. And since Allison from the Resolved Mysteries podcast was one of the people who asked me this question, I guess I should recommend her show as well. I mentioned earlier that Allison and 2 of her friends release episodes where they break down unsolved mysteries cases and episodes, and they had me as a guest on last month with them to record an interview. So if you're a fan of unsolved mysteries, I highly recommend you check them out as well. Our next question is from Michelle. I was wondering if you had any true crime book recommendations for fans of your podcast. Well, what's interesting is that while researching a lot of podcast episodes, I've actually come across a lot of true crime books that have helped me with my research, but also happen to be very riveting as well. I think the best one I've read is Fatal Flaw by Philip Finch, because it covers the Tommy Ziegler case. And I think it's safe to say that I never would have been able to construct a podcast episode about this story without it, because it does an excellent job at breaking down the facts of the case and helping you keep track of all the different characters and all the different eyewitness accounts. And he pretty much performed a miracle putting that convoluted case together into a very coherent and compelling story. So I highly recommend it as well, even though it came out during the early 1990s. I also, other true crime books about, I'd also recommend are Fatal Vision by Joe McGinnis about the Jeffrey McDonald's case, The Devil's Knot by Mara Leverett about the West Memphis 3 case. Also, I recently released an episode about the disappearance of Larry Griffin, the missing postman of Strad Valley. And there's a really good book about it called The Missing Postman by an Irish author named Faulkner O'Driscoll. And it's kind of like Fatal Flaw in that it takes a very convoluted case and tells a story that could be very, very confusing, but assembles it together in a very coherent fashion. And I think it's safe to say that I never would have been able to put together a podcast episode about it without using that book as a guide. I'm also a fan of the book Echo of Distant Water by J.B. Fisher. It covered the Martin family disappearance from 1958, which I covered on the podcast earlier this year, and it also served as a very useful guide. And another one that sticks out is Without a Trace about the 1974 disappearance of Amy Billig, which I also covered on the podcast. It's co-written by an author named Greg Anapu and Amy Billig's mother, Susan Billig. It tells a really riveting story about a missing persons case, which unfortunately is still unsolved to this day. Our next question is from Jim, and it's, are you for or against the death penalty? Well, overall, I would have to say I'm against the death penalty, but I think that opinion is influenced by the fact that I have covered quite a few cases on the podcast in which innocent people have been sent to death row. I mean, I will acknowledge that there are some evil people in this world who probably do deserve the death penalty, but I think the biggest issue with that is that there are a lot of innocent people who are sent to death row for crimes they do not commit. And I've always thought the most disturbing part of that is that often the police and the prosecutors who handle these cases are well aware that they're sending an innocent person to death row, but they just don't care. I think one of the most disturbing stories I ever featured on the podcast was the Sharif Hussein case, which took place in New Orleans in 1995, where a 16-year-old African-American kid named Sharif Hussein was convicted of a murder and sent to death row. And it's horrifying enough that a person at that age, who was still technically a minor, would be given the death penalty. But in that case, there was such egregious misconduct from both the prosecutors and the police, where they deliberately withheld evidence that Sharif was innocent or fabricated evidence. I mean, all they cared about was securing a conviction and sending someone to death row. And even though he was like an innocent 16-year-old kid, they did not care. They just were willing to send him to die as long as they solved the case and it did not make them look bad. And the way I look at it, if you want a functional death penalty system, the United States will have to work much, much harder at rooting out the corruption that takes place, because if there are few consequences for people who send innocent defendants to death row, then this sort of thing will never stop. I mean, the worst punishment anyone ever received for wrongfully convicting Sharif Hussein was a 3-month suspension for one of the prosecuting attorneys, and that hardly seems like a fair trade-off when you commit misconduct and nearly get an innocent 16-year-old kid executed, and all you receive is a slap on the wrist, a 3-month suspension. I mean, you have to give much harsher penalties than that to people who do something like that if you want to have a functional death penalty system. So until they get rid of all those issues, there's no way I could possibly be for the death penalty. I mean, earlier in this episode, you heard me reference the Orange Socks case, the murder of Deborah Jackson, and I mentioned that Henry Lee Lucas was originally charged and convicted of her murder and sent to death row for it, even though it now seems likely that he was in another state at the time, and his confession to her murder was false. I mean, Henry Lee Lucas was obviously a murderer and did kill some people, but the only crime he ever received a death sentence for was the murder of Deborah Jackson, and because that was one crime he likely did not commit, he actually had his death sentence commuted by George W. Bush when he was governor of Texas during the 1990s, and Lucas wound up dying of natural causes inside a prison. I'm sure no one would shed any tears if Lucas had been executed, because he definitely is a horrible human being. But the problem is that if you execute people for crimes they did not commit, then the real killer winds up getting away with it. And that's what's happened here. Because they railroaded the wrong person, the real killer of Deborah Jackson has still not been caught to this day. I think my opinion might be influenced by the fact that I live in Canada and we have not had the death penalty up here in many, many years. And I'm sure as you well know that one of the most evil monsters our country has ever had is Paul Bernardo. And while he did not receive the death penalty, he has spent the last 2 decades living in a very small prison cell where he has to remain for 23 hours per day. And it sounds like a pretty miserable existence that he will have to experience for the rest of his life until he dies of natural causes. And as far as I'm concerned, that's an adequate enough punishment for a monster like him rather than executing him. So I think that the people who commit heinous crimes, I think that's a more adequate punishment than the death penalty, which is why I'm generally against it. So our next question is from Michelle. If you got to name any boat or ship, what would you name it? Well, I know that the one thing I would not name it is the Freedon, which I'm sure if you've heard my recent Trail Went Cold episode about a missing boat called the Freedon, makes sense. There's kind of a running joke on Unsolved Mysteries is to never give your boat a title that sounds like freedom, because they've had 2 separate stories about missing boats, one which was called the Freedon and one which was called the Freedom 2. So it's kind of a running gag. Never give your boat a name that sounds like freedom or something bad will happen to it. And I'd also advise against naming your boat the Casey Nicole as well. I will say, though, that if I ever bought a sailboat, I would probably name it The Sail Went Cold. Okay, I apologize for that one. Our next question is from Matt. I remember when the show first started, you said you didn't plan to do episodes on cases with a ton of coverage from other podcasts, a smart and understandable choice. That said, I'd still enjoy hearing your brief theories on some big cases. Well, I got this same question on my Q&A episode 2 years ago, so I'm going to share my thoughts about 3 of those cases that I talked about back then. The JonBenet Ramsey case, I'm one of the few who does not lean towards that infamous theory that her brother Burke was responsible. I think when you put it all together, it really doesn't make much sense. I know that I said in my Q&A episode a couple years ago that I was kind of back and forth between maybe the parents being responsible or an intruder. Honestly, now I lean more towards the intruder theory. I mentioned earlier in this episode that the one thing about this case which drives me crazy is the ransom note, because no matter whether you lean towards the theory of the parents being responsible or an intruder, that ransom note just doesn't make any damn sense. I mean, a lot of people have said there's no way that an actual killer would write a ransom note that long, but I always think of the possibility that if JonBenet was killed accidentally or otherwise, it's really hard to imagine her parents writing that ransom note themselves, such an extensive piece of writing, when they're in that state of mind. So I still think it's probably the most baffling piece of evidence I've ever seen in an unsolved case. But honestly, after listening to the True Crime Garage series that they released around last Christmas, they lean towards an intruder being responsible, and I kind of lean towards that way as well. I've always been intrigued by the theory that it might have been some sicko who was living out an elaborate fantasy of some sort, that he hid out in the Ramsey residence for a while before they got home from the Christmas party, and that's when he wrote that note, and afterwards they went to bed is when he decided to abduct and kill JonBenet. But I don't know, there's just nothing about this case which rings right to me. And I could possibly change my mind at any moment if new evidence surfaces, but the one thing about the case I'm absolutely certain about, pretty much, is that I do not believe her brother Burke was responsible. I think that theory falls apart the more you think about it. On the last episode, I also talked about the Madeleine McCann case, and even though I still believe that her parents did an irresponsible thing by leaving her alone in the hotel room while they went out for dinner, I've never really believed that they were responsible for her disappearance. And as you probably heard, over the course of the last year they've been looking into the possibility that a convicted German pedophile might be responsible for her disappearance. So hopefully there are answers soon. But I continue to believe that she was abducted by a stranger who subsequently murdered her, and that her parents had nothing to do with it. And one more big case that I want to address is the Maura Murray disappearance, which the true crime community is just obsessed with. To be honest, years ago, I always leaned towards the theory that she simply walked away from her vehicle after abandoning it and died of exposure in the woods somewhere, and that her remains simply haven't been found. But on the other hand, there is just so much drama surrounding this case that I still have a feeling in the back of my mind that there has to be more to this story. I mean, I don't necessarily believe that she disappeared and started a new life, but I get the impression that something else is going on, and that the explanation of her just simply dying in the woods just seems too simple. I don't know if that's what actually happened, but if they happened to stumble upon her remains someday and it turned out that it was Occam's razor and that she did die of exposure, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised, but until then, I will continue to have an open mind about this case. The next question is from Rupert. What are your thoughts on the case of Bryce Laspisa? Suicide makes the most sense to me, but I was curious to what you thought and why. Well, in case you're not familiar with that case, Bryce Laspisa was a 19-year-old student attending college who was driving home to visit his family in California, and that at around 2 a.m, he phoned his mother and said that he was too tired to drive and was going to stop his car and go to sleep. But this was the last time he was ever heard from, and shortly thereafter, his abandoned car was found next to the side of a remote road, and Bryce has never been seen again. It looked like that Bryce had gotten into some sort of accident and left all his possessions behind in his car, but a search of the area turned up no trace of him. This case has been compared with the Maura Murray disappearance, and I've received a couple of requests to cover it on the podcast, but it has already been extensively covered on other podcasts like Trace Evidence, though I may cover it at some point in the future. I definitely tend to lean towards there not being foul play involved in this case. I think that Bryce wandered away from his car voluntarily. He either suffered some sort of mental break of some sort and then went to a remote area where he either ended his own life or just died of exposure, and they have just not found his remains during any of the search efforts. It sounds like that Bryce was acting strangely in the time period prior to his disappearance, and I've heard a lot of rumors that he kind of had a troubled relationship with his own family, so I think something in him just snapped and he wandered off. And while I'm hopeful that there's a possibility that he could have disappeared into the homeless or transient population somewhere and has just never been found, I have a feeling he's dead and they just haven't recovered his remains, but hopefully that will happen someday. Our next question is from Dustin. Have you ever considered covering the deaths of Chris Kramers and Lizanne Froon, the Dutch students who went missing during a hike in Panama in 2014? The details of the case are so mysterious and haunting, it could make for a great podcast episode in the new year. Well, I've definitely gotten a lot of requests to cover this case, and I know that it has been covered on a number of other podcasts, and I still remember when it took place in 2014, Reddit pretty much blew up because there were endless discussions about this case, but while I haven't done extensive research, I've always been inclined to believe that this was probably just a death by misadventure, that these two poor young women got lost while on their hike and succumbed to the elements, and that a lot of the so-called mysterious details in this story have been overblown and exaggerated. Well, there are admittedly some very strange details in the story. I kind of liken this to the Eliza Lamb death, where the internet has kind of taken a great tragedy and kind of overblown it a little bit to turn it into an unsolved mystery. But overall, I think the truth is probably a lot more simple, and that this was just all a tragic accident. All that being said, I haven't really delved too deeply into this case, so I wouldn't write out the possibility of doing a podcast episode about it sometime down the line, but I think the main reason I've avoided it before is that there was just this one phase where it seemed like virtually every other true crime podcast was releasing episodes about this story, and as you well know, I try to veer away from cases like that, so, but hey, I won't completely discount the possibility that I might cover it someday. Our next comment is from Tony. Do you think Marilyn Monroe was murdered, or do you think Kurt Cobain was murdered? Well, I've never really believed that at all about Kurt Cobain. I mean, it's not hard to imagine that he would have decided to commit suicide because he was a guy with a history of drug problems and depression, so I've never really found it that implausible that he would have decided to take his own life, so... I mean, I know that they've written books and done documentaries with conspiracy theories involving murder, but I've never really bought into them, so even though I've gotten a few requests to cover this story on the podcast, I probably won't, because I've always really believed, ever since the 1990s, that this was a suicide, and I would prefer to let Kurt rest in peace. As far as Marilyn Monroe, honestly, until recent years, I had no idea there were even murder conspiracies surrounding her death. I always assumed that it was generally accepted that her death was a suicide. But of course, I can understand why people would think that she might have been the victim of foul play, as there are a few odd things surrounding her death, and of course, the whole... fact that she was involved with the Kennedys and that her death took place just over a year before the JFK assassination, so I can understand why there are so many conspiracy theories surrounding her story, but overall, she was a woman who had substance abuse issues and mental health issues, so I have no trouble believing the official version of events that her death was a suicide, though I've never really delved too deeply into this case, but who knows, maybe if I go down the rabbit hole, I might change my mind, but at the moment, I have no trouble believing the official version of events, and that the conspiracy theories surrounding her death are just a way too out there for my liking. Our next question is from Matt, who asks, which currently unresolved case do you think will end up having a much simpler explanation than what the consensus currently holds? Well, we've already talked about Maura Murray, where there are all sorts of wild theories when it's possible that she simply wandered her way away from the vehicle and succumbed to the elements inside the woods. But I want to talk about a case where I do believe that the missing victim was abducted and murdered, but I think that the case and all the theories surrounding it have become massively overblown, and that's the disappearance of Johnny Gosch. If you're not familiar with this story, Johnny Gosch was a 12-year-old boy living in Iowa who went out to deliver papers during the early morning hours, but then vanished without a trace. It would go on to become one of the most infamous missing children's cases of all time, but you may have seen a documentary which aired on Netflix for a couple years called Who Took Johnny?, which explored this very deep conspiracy theory that Johnny had become victimized by a massive pedophile ring that caters to some of the most rich and powerful people in the United States. And Johnny's mother would even claim that after he became an adult, he escaped from his captors and actually came to visit her sometime during the mid-1990s. I mean, this case is a very deep rabbit hole that is filled with a lot of wild conspiracy theories. And even though I've never covered it on The Trail Went Cold, there was a time when I spent a lot of time researching this case, but the more I've thought about it over the years, the more I think that all these theories about him becoming a member of a pedophile ring are probably way overblown, and that this case probably has a much more simple explanation. I'm sure that Johnny was abducted by a predator when he went out to deliver papers that morning, but it's possible that it wasn't anyone associated with a pedophile ring. It was just some random person who was scouting him and probably murdered him within hours of him being abducted, and they've just never found his remains or identified who was responsible. But I think all these conspiracy theories have kind of clouded the case, and it would not surprise me at all if it turned out that the actual truth was a lot more simple. I mean, another famous missing children's case from the 1980s is the 1989 abduction of Jacob Wetterling. And for a while, it seemed like that case would never be solved. But then nearly 30 years after the fact, they finally found Jacob's remains, and it turned out that he was abducted by a random predator who subsequently murdered him. And it would not surprise me at all if that's the explanation for what actually happened to Johnny Gosch. Our next question is from Jim. What states have been the location in your cases the most, and have any states not been used? Well, that was a very interesting question. I never had really thought about it before, so I actually had to dig through my listing of cases that I've covered to see which states have been well represented and if there are any states that have not been covered at all. And one state in which I've done a lot of cases, which probably won't surprise any of you, is Florida. Because as you know, Florida seems to be the one state where the craziest stuff always seems to happen. And it seems I've done a lot of cases from Florida this year as well. It seems to be the one state I keep going back to when it comes to unsolved cold cases. And another state which I've done a lot of cases for within the past year is Texas. So apparently a lot of strange stuff happens in Texas. And I guess it's only appropriate because next year's CrimeCon event is set to take place in Austin, Texas. And if we can travel again, it will be my first time traveling to that state. So I guess it's only appropriate that I've covered a lot of cases from there on The Trail Went Cold. As far as northern states go, it seems like I've done a lot of cases from Ohio, especially within the last few months. I've done the Mary Jane Van Gilder case, the disappearance of Erica Baker, and also the weird story about Bill and Dorothy Wacker. So Ohio has been very well represented on The Trail Went Cold. But by my count, I think there are only 3 states that I have never done a case for on The Trail Went Cold, and they are Maine, Utah, and Nebraska. So I guess that will be one of my goals for 2021, that I will do at least one case from those 3 states. And I suppose we should also give an honorable mention to Delaware. I guess I technically haven't done a Delaware case yet, but the Jonathan Luna case, he actually, even though he left Maryland, he actually drove through Delaware on the night he was killed for a brief period before he wound up dead in Pennsylvania. So Delaware has gotten representation on the podcast, even though I haven't done a case that actually took place there. So I guess I will make that another goal to do a Delaware cold case on The Trail Went Cold sometime in 2021. Next question is from Amy. What are your best sources for research, and how do you determine what is fact versus hearsay? Since the pandemic, I have listened to a lot of different true crime podcasts. I have heard the same cases covered on different shows. It's interesting what different facts each person focuses on. What's your process on deciding what to include? Well, one of the best sources for research for The Trail Went Cold is newspapers.com. I think that getting a subscription to that service was the best thing I ever did, and is worth every penny, because you will find a lot of information about cases that you will not find anywhere else on the internet. And what I think is one of the best features is that you can research chronologically. You can go from the start of a case to the very end in order, which has been very helpful in order to track the progression of a case a lot of the time, and helps me construct my scripts whenever I'm putting together an episode. As far as facts versus hearsay goes, that's a really interesting question, because I will often find in my research some very interesting comments on message boards or on Reddit, and I often have to decide, is this worth mentioning on my podcast? Because a lot of the time these posts will have information which has not been verified by any official police or media source, so I can't vouch for its accuracy, but sometimes I think the information is interesting enough that I will include it on the episode, but I will make a disclaimer that that this post is the only source of this information, and that you should not take it to be 100% concrete fact. But as a recent example of this, I did a case about the missing boat, the Freedon, which had a very interesting Reddit post from someone who claimed that he spoke to Paul Cornwell, the former boyfriend of the missing woman in that case, and he shared a lot of interesting information which was never mentioned on the Unsolved Mystery episode or any other media source. And while I can't vouch with 100% accuracy that this information is true, it was still pretty interesting, so I thought it was worth mentioning, though I did have to say that because it was a Reddit post, I can't be 100% certain that it is true. But another example is when I did my episode about the disappearance of the Springfield Three. Because as you well know, one of the most infamous theories in that case is that the bodies of the 3 missing women are buried underneath the parking garage of a local hospital, which some people accept as fact. But a lot of people didn't know is that this theory originated during a web sleuth thread about this case, where someone who claimed to be a psychic said they were visited by the ghost of one of the victims who told them that their bodies were buried underneath the parking garage. And this rumor was spread enough that some people started taking it as fact, especially since it was mentioned on the Disappeared episode about this case. So I think this is a primary example of a theory which I believe was invented by the internet, but is now accepted as fact by many people, so I decided to take the opportunity on the episode to break down the whole story and tell people why this theory is not very likely. And ironically enough, I used as some of my backup a Reddit post someone had made who had experience in construction and structural engineering, and they came up with a plausible explanation for why it would probably be impossible to bury the bodies of 3 people under the parking garage of a hospital that was under construction, because sooner or later the ground would probably collapse and they would have found the bodies by now. So I found that information very useful to debunk the theory. But that's why I think it's very interesting to spend some time on my podcast episodes determining the difference between fact and hearsay. Next, we have John and Kimberly, 2 listeners who sent me variations of the same question, so I'm going to answer both of them here. Have you considered doing more historical mysteries? There's the well-known stuff like Jack the Ripper, the Lost Colony of Roanoke, but there are plenty of them to go into. But all to listen, you get a lot of extraneous information and off-the-wall theories. I think your approach to covering information in your podcast could work in providing an interesting take on such historical mysteries. How old is too old for you to cover a case? I can only think of famous old cold cases, but for example, the Villisca Axe murders that occurred in 1912. Do you consider that too old to be worth covering? Well, I really do like covering old or cold cases on The Trail Went Cold, even though I think there's very little chance they're going to be solved. I think the oldest one I did cover was the Ambrose Small disappearance, which took place in Toronto way back in 1919. And you mentioned the Villisca Axe murders. Even though I haven't covered it on The Trail Went Cold, I actually did a joint episode with the Thinking Sideways crew, where they released an anniversary episode where they got a whole bunch of different true crime podcasters, including myself, to talk about different theories involved in that case. So I have done research and talked about it, even though it wasn't on my own podcast. I think one of the main reasons I like doing older mysteries is just so I can provide a picture of just how much different the world was back then and how different crime scene investigation was. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, I released my episode about the disappearance of Larry Griffin, which took place in Ireland all the way back in 1929. And it was just a much different time back then, and I just thought it was just so fascinating to research the form of crime scene investigation that they used back then, and the fact that forensics were just very basic, because they found a lot of items in that case that appeared to have blood on them, but because forensics are nowhere near as advanced as they are today, they could not conclusively determine if the blood was even human or animal blood, or determine if it belonged to the victim. And that's a case where I think things would have turned out much differently if they had today's technology available to them at that time. So I think the answer is that while I don't think I will do any unsolved mysteries which took place way back in, say, the 1600s or the 1700s, I can honestly say that no case is too old for The Trail Went Cold, because I have a fascination for older stories such as that. I mean, I don't think I will do the more well-known stuff like Jack the Ripper or the Lost Colony of Roanoke, because I think that stuff has been done to death. But if I find any mysteries that took place in, say, the 1800s that I think are very intriguing and haven't been covered too extensively, then I definitely would be willing to cover them on the podcast. And our next question is from Mike, and he actually sent in this question for my original Q&A episode 2 years ago, and he sent it again to see if I had any updates or new stories to share. And the question is, have you ever had any scary or creepy incidents where people have called you or emailed you and left harassing, creepy, or threatening messages relating to the cases you've covered? Well, I'm still been lucky enough that I haven't had anyone harass or threaten me, but as many of you probably know, I recently underwent a very weird incident where I discovered that a man who was arrested for murder in one of the cases I covered on the podcast turned out to be one of my Patreon supporters. In January of 2017, I released a mini-sode about the disappearance of Janelle Matthews, a 12-year-old girl who vanished from her home in Greeley, Colorado in December of 1984. In July of 2019, during a construction project at a remote site located several miles from her house, they inadvertently wound up coming across some human remains, and DNA testing positively identified the remains as belonging to Janelle. And just a few months before this episode's release, they finally arrested a suspect in Janelle's disappearance named Steve Pankey, who had since moved to Idaho. Well, earlier this year, I made the shocking discovery while looking through my list of supporters who have signed up with me on Patreon that Steve Pankey was one of them. And what's crazy is that he originally signed up in May of 2019, before Janelle's remains were discovered, and at the time, I had no idea who he was. When I originally recorded my podcast episode in 2017, they had not named any suspects or persons of interest, so I never mentioned anything about Steve Pankey, and it was only after the discovery of her remains in July of 2019 that Pankey was named by the authorities as a person of interest, and he started giving a number of interviews with the media after that, trying to defend himself and proclaim his innocence. But by October of 2020, they thought they had assembled a solid enough case against him to make an arrest. And of course, since Pankey signed up originally on Patreon before he was named as a person of interest, I did not put two and two together until earlier this year. Now, at the time he originally signed up, The Trail Went Cold was probably the only podcast that had covered the Janelle Matthews case, so I think it's reasonable to assume that that's how he discovered it. And if you look at Steve Pankey's profile page on Patreon, you'll find that he is actually a supporter for a number of different true crime podcasts, but the key difference is that mine is the only one out of them that has covered the case in which he has been charged with murder. But what's particularly insane is that he signed up for the highest tier, which meant that he was pledging me $10 per month and doing so for an entire year and a half before his arrest. So he must have genuinely liked the podcast if he was willing to send me money. But the idea of him listening to an episode about a crime that he committed is just such a creepy and unsettling thought. I mean, when you sign up to be a supporter on Patreon, it's a standard practice for me to send out stickers and thank you cards to every one of them, so I definitely sent a card to this guy before I realized who he was. Anyway, I've since donated all the money I received from Pankey over the past year and a half to a non-profit organization called Private Investigations for the Missing, and since it's still technically charging his credit card, I will continue to send all the money that I get from him to good causes until his credit card expires. If you want to learn more information about this situation, I actually did an interview last month on the podcast Crawl Space, where I went more in depth into the case and the whole situation. So if you want to learn more, I recommend you check it out. I have no idea when Pankey's trial is actually going to take place, and technically he is still innocent until proven guilty. But once this entire story is over, I'm definitely going to release an entire episode about this whole saga, which outlines everything that happened from beginning to end. And this leads us to our final question of the episode from JS, and it's definitely the most important question I will ever answer. When you eat Pringles, how many do you eat in one bite? I don't know, JS. I think that question's a little personal, so you might be crossing a major line there. Honestly, I can't even remember the last time I even ate Pringles, but I assure you the next time I do eat Pringles, I will keep track of how many I eat in one bite, and I might release an update episode in which I provide an in-depth answer to this question. So that about brings an end to this year's special Q&A episode, so a big thanks to everyone who sent in a question, and I hope I answered them to your satisfaction. Like I mentioned in the intro, 2020 was a truly hellacious year for everyone, but on the bright side, podcasting is the one medium where you continue to produce content without leaving your home, so hopefully, our show has helped provide some of you with an escape. As of right now, I will continue to produce new episodes and live stream sessions and continue hosting our annual Unsolved Mysteries live watch parties. I hope that things are much better in 2021 and things improve to the point where I'll be able to see some of you in person at some podcasting events next year. But if not, I hope you all continue to stay safe and healthy and have yourself a happy new year. And before I bring this episode to a close, I'd just like to give a shout out to a very special listener whose birthday just happens to fall on the release date of this episode. So happy birthday, Ellie. So join us again next Wednesday, which is technically next year, when we return to our normal schedule and drop an all-new episode of The Trail Went Cold.